Welcome to eGestalt's webinar titled How to Do Security Risk Analysis for Your Business. Security Harden Your Business. Today's presenter is Anupam Sahai, co-founder and president of eGestalt. Anupam is an accomplished management, marketing, and technology leader with 21 plus years of experience directing teams to develop and launch globally renowned products, generating up to hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Prior to eGestalt, Anupam was Vice President Marketing for IKEA Inc. He is a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare, IT, cloud computing, security, and compliance, networking, and is a featured speaker at several industry conferences worldwide. We want to tailor this webinar for this webinar and our future webinars in order to make sure the content matches the audience. So we're going to ask a couple, actually three, demographic questions in the form of a poll. So if you can look at your GoToWebinar area in the poll section, let me launch the first poll question. All right, what is your current status? Are you a covered entity, business associate, service provider, or other? And go ahead and answer this. We're going to close the poll in about 5 seconds here. Okay, great. I'm going to close the poll and share the results. What is your current status? So 35% of you answered business associate and service provider, with 23% as covered entity. All right, let me launch the second question here. What is your position? Are you an executive, compliance-related, risk privacy-related, IT-related, or other? Please answer the poll, and I'll be closing it in about 10 seconds. Okay, 5 more seconds. Get your last votes in. Let me close it right now. All right, so what is your current position? 48% of you are IT-related, and then 17% for both compliance-related and risk privacy-related. Now let me ask the third question here. Have you undergone a security risk, have you undergone a security risk analysis? Yes or no? Okay, I'll be closing the poll in 5 seconds. All right, I'm closing it. Pretty close. Have you undergone a security risk analysis? 52% no, 48% yes. Okay, great. Thank you for participating in this poll. Excuse me, if you have any questions, please send them via the questions function. You can also use the chat function. I'll be monitoring both, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. If you'd like a copy, please send an email directly to Anupam. His contact information will be given at the end. Thank you, Anupam, for presenting, and I'll turn the webinar over to you now.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning and good afternoon. So the topic of the webinar today is to look at security risk analysis and how it will help you harden your business. It's a fairly involved and complex topic. So what I will try to do is to simplify it, describe what are the key elements that comprise security risk analysis. I'll then talk about the steps required to do the analysis, followed by taking some examples in the HIPAA domain where you're required to do security risk analysis as a part of HIPAA high-tech compliance and also to secure federal grant dollars. I'll talk about some of the best practices and caveats and how to deal with the issues found. And at the end, I'll talk about AGFI, which is an automated tool built for the ground up to deal with any security and compliance issues, and also it also supports a completely automated way of doing security risk analysis. And then at the end, we'll have Q&A. Before I start, let me give some standard disclaimers about the information being presented. So NIST, HIPAA, high-tech are the sources of some of the information that we'll discuss today. While every effort has been made to ensure that the information is correct, clearly this is a huge domain and an evolving subject. And so Please don't use this for legal purposes. This is meant for educational and awareness purposes only. So let's get right into it. Let's look into what are the key elements that comprise risk analysis. Before we begin, risk analysis, as I said, is a complex topic, and there are multiple perspectives that affect the businesses. There is the security risk angle, which I'll talk about. There's also the risk coming from the compliance angle, and if you're a business or a business owner or a service provider, you want to look at risk from both the perspectives. And as we go through the presentation, it'll become clearer, hopefully, how these two different aspects come into play. So some background information. This is from Semantic. This is the Internet Security Report. And one thing is very clear, that breaches are widespread. And there are roughly about 5 to 15 million identities stolen every month, with about 10 to 25 incidents that are happening every month as well. So it's a huge amount of onslaught that's being pushed forward by cyber attackers or malicious insiders. And how do these breaches happen? This is again coming from the Verizon breach report, that 52% involves some kind of hacking. And the different kinds of attacks and responsible for the breaches are either due to malware, it could be because of privilege misuse, which is due to an insider misusing their access and credibility. So as you can see, there are a number of different sources of breaches or attacks. And if you dig deeper, the objectives for these breaches are, a lot of it is driven by financial motives. They're trying to steal the crown jewels in the company, whether it's intellectual property, it could be patient records in the case of HIPAA, medical organizations, or it could just be to cause confusion and brand damage. And most of the breaches take weeks and months to discover, and a lot of these breaches are discovered by external parties. And this statistics at least was very surprising to me, and kind of, it says that 97% of the breaches are avoidable if simple or intermediate controls were put in place. So what this means is that most of the organizations are not taking basic steps to evaluate their risk posture or security posture, and if they did, they could avoid most of these breaches. So that's the light at the end of the tunnel, which allows us to understand how to go about doing security risk analysis. So before we jump into the topic, let me just put some definitions out there so we can have a common vocabulary as we go through the presentation. So risk, which is the main topic and focus of the discussion, is really the likelihood of a given threat triggering or exploiting a certain weakness in the organization, and the resulting impact that it will bring about to the organization as a result of this exploitation. And so there are multiple aspects here. The threat could exploit and steal data, which means that it can be loss of information that is the cause of the problem or the result of the attack, sorry. And the impact could, this could impact mission critical operations in the organization, which could be critical to the functioning of the company or the business. So the risk assessment is really the process of identifying, estimating, and prioritizing the security risks that the business is facing. And how do we do that is really the purpose of the webinar today. So why do we need to do risk analysis? Let's start there. As I said, the main objective is to identify weak links in the organization, and if some threat is exploiting those weak links, causing massive amount of damage. So the impact analysis is a key part of risk analysis. If data is stolen which is not critical to the organization, that's less risky than if critical data is stolen which has a huge impact and value to the organization. So risk analysis allows you to identify the weak links in the organization and their fallout and the fallout of exploitation because of these weak links. So if you don't do risk analysis, the result could be security breaches, and again, lots of studies have shown that an average cost of a breach is about $5.5 million with $194 per record stolen. And if you can imagine a credit card or a PCI or a financial institution or a healthcare entity where there might be hundreds and thousands of patient records, for example, you can easily estimate the losses could run up to multi-million dollars. And this is just the financial aspect to it. It doesn't include the brand damage and the potential patient or customer lawsuits that follow. So there's a huge penalty to be paid here if you get breached. And number of regulations like HIPAA high-tech I mentioned has put in some safeguards and recommendations for increased fines if you get breached, if you lose patient information, and risk analysis is required to also prove meaningful use to get the federal grant dollars. As part of that requirement, conducting a security risk analysis is required. Similarly, if you look at other regulations like PCI, FSMA, and SOX, they have some controls requirement to conduct risk analysis. From an organizational point of view, you might want to think about risk management as a way to quantify and justify IT spending, specifically around security and compliance related budgets. And this allows you to quantify and tie dollars amounts to the opportunity cost. In case you don't do security risk analysis, you can put together some quantifiable cost structure and opportunity cost structure to justify it. Okay, so from a risk management perspective, there are multiple steps that are required. Let's start with the different steps involved in the process. The first step is to identify and determine the threats that the organization faces now and later. It also involves understanding the vulnerabilities, the weak links in the organization that can be exploited by these threats and their potential impact. And the vulnerabilities or the weak links could be either assets, which could be software or hardware IT assets. It could be people, it could be processes, and anything that the organization treasures. So all of those are construed to be potential target of attacks and target of the threats that are faced by the organization. We also need to look at controls or processes or sort of actions undertaken by the organization to deal with such vulnerabilities and threats. And as we go through the presentation, we'll kind of dive into a little bit more detail for each of these different steps. And then once you know this, once you assess the risk, there's a need to continuously monitor the risk, manage the risk, because threats can change, assets can change. A business is a dynamic organism. It changes with time, and as things change, there's a need to continuously monitor risk and manage it. Again, taking the example of HIPAA high-tech, the HIPAA security rule requires organizations to conduct risk analysis and risk management. I keep talking about HIPAA high-tech because that's relevant for medical organizations, and that's an example. But any other regulation framework like PCI, FSMA, SOX will also require you to do risk analysis and management to ensure that you're able to get a perspective on the risks that an organization faces and how to manage it. So here are some examples of concrete examples besides the market research information that I showed earlier. Here are some examples of the breaches that happened, and these are mostly related to the healthcare industry, where either hospitals or covered entities got breached, and besides the fines levied by the HHS, the Health and Human Services, there is brand damage, there is patient lawsuits and customer lawsuits that come about. So the penalties and the cost of being breached and not managing risk is very high. And if you look at the healthcare industry, the number of breaches that have affected individual businesses or state level care institutions are just too big. And again, statistics out there tell us that roughly about 900 to 1,000 breaches happen every month. This is again healthcare only, reported by HHS, Health and Human Services, organizational entity that's managing and monitoring HIPAA high-tech related breaches. So the breach tally is growing, it's increasing, and there's a huge need for healthcare organizations and every other organization to do risk analysis, to deal with breaches, and to prevent breaches from happening. So now let's jump into some of the risk management models. What are the different aspects that one needs to understand to do risk management? And we're kind of diving a little bit deeper into the different variables that are required to manage risk, to measure risk, and to quantify risk, as it were, so that you can then prioritize and focus on the top issues that concern you as a business and then go about managing it. So risk models is a framework which allows you to put things in perspective and put together a process around this model. And if you look at the risk model, any risk model, and there are multiple risk models that you'll see, there are multiple models that depends on the country that you're in, or it depends on the regulation that you're following. But any risk model will have these three factors. One is the evaluation and assessment stage, wherein you are identifying assets, evaluating their properties and characteristics. Once you understand that, then you go to the risk assessment stage, which allows you to discover all the threats and vulnerabilities that pose risk to the assets that were ascertained in the first stage. And once you know the threats and vulnerabilities, then you're trying to prioritize and manage the risk by mitigating them, by putting together either the existing controls that you have are in place are effective, or you might have to put together additional controls or processes to deal with risk mitigation issues so that you can manage the risk and it is within your control. And again, we'll talk about what does in control mean, what is a low risk versus a high risk. So typically any risk model will have risk factors that are used to compute the risk that an organization is measuring, is trying to assess, and is trying to manage. And typically the risk factors include threat, vulnerability, impact, likelihood, and predisposing conditions. So these are the variables that you need to measure in a business to understand the risk value. And this is what you're trying to measure to understand the risk exposure, and then you can manage it using risk mitigation tools. So let's understand the risk factors in a bit more detail. What is a threat? Well, a threat is any circumstances, any event that can adversely affect the organization. And the organizational effect could be in the form of assets, in the form of individuals, it could be in the form of operations that basically could lead to a loss of information or loss of functionality. And a threat is characterized as a method or an intent to exploit a vulnerability. It could be a hostile cybersecurity attacker coming from outside. It could be a malicious insider who's trying to compromise information, or it could be a disgruntled employee. The threat could come from either a person. It could also be because your servers are sitting on the internet and they're exposed to it and exposed to cyber attackers. So all of these are potential threats. It could also be human errors that can cause a threat. Accidental misuse is a big part of what causes a threat. The second factor is vulnerability. And vulnerability is really a weakness or a weak link in the organization that can potentially or deliberately be exploited. And this could be a system procedure. It could be internal controls that could be exploited by a threat source. And typically, if you have a server which doesn't have patches, or if there is malware installed in a server that you're not aware of, those are vulnerabilities that can potentially be compromised by an insider or an outsider. Associated factor in figuring out risk is a predisposing condition. And if your business is located in a cyclone or an earthquake-prone zone, that's a risk factor. Or if you have a server sitting on the internet, that's more prone and predisposed to being attacked versus a server sitting in a locked caged room behind a firewall or not connected to the internet at all. So there are predisposing conditions that might affect your risk computation and risk factor contribution from that particular variable. The next factor is likelihood, and likelihood is really the probability that the threat is going to exploit the vulnerability and the potential impact that the threat acting upon the vulnerability is. So it looks into both the threat probability and the chances of a threat being happening or being actionable, and the impact likelihood that might result because of the threat action. So it's looking into things like what is the adversary intent, what's the adversary capability, and what is the adversary targeting. And the adversary here could be an insider or an outsider or accidental usage scenario that I talked about. And there's a typical time frame issue involved as well, and as you evaluate likelihood. The impact variable talks about the magnitude of harm that will be caused to the organization, either because of loss of information, loss of functionality, or loss of availability of the system or the data that's being misused or that's being attacked. So it's an important element in the analysis, because ultimately, if a particular vulnerability is being exploited that's of low value, that is not as risky as a low chance of a high impact data being lost. And so there is a quantification process here, which could be also qualitative in terms of data loss being significant or insignificant, that is used to compute the risk exposure for an organization. And impact plays a big role in that. So if you put it all together, all the variables that I talked about, this is really the model that we are talking about. And this is a generic model with risk factors that I talked about. So we started out with threat source, which has certain set of characteristics. which initiates certain actions to exploit vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities are present in assets. Assets could be hardware, software devices. It could be people, organization, or data lying around. So the vulnerabilities are being exploited by these threats. These assets may have predisposing conditions, which makes it either predisposed or less prone to being exploited. There might be a set of security controls that prevent these threats from exploiting these vulnerabilities. If you patched your system, if you have taken steps to ensure that the server with the mission critical data is locked behind a physical door in a server room which is not connected to the internet, that's a control. So the security controls either predispose or prevent such threats from exploiting these vulnerabilities, if possible at all. And so once you've looked at all these vulnerabilities with security controls in place, and if threats are successfully able to exploit these vulnerabilities, there is an impact with a certain likelihood. And by looking at all these variables, all these risk factors, you arrive at a risk value, which can be quantitative or qualitative, which will give you a sense of where does the organization stand vis-a-vis the risk posture for the business. And I'll take you through some more detailed steps to get there. So essentially, from a risk management posture perspective, we're talking about a 6-tuple. There are 6 variables that really come to the foreground. There are assets in the organization which will be exploited by the threats or threat sources, and the vulnerabilities in these assets are really the target of attacks from the threat sources. And if there are controls in place, then you can prevent certain attacks, and depending on which attacks still are able to successfully go through, there's a likelihood and impact of all these combinations. So from a risk model perspective, from a risk management perspective, you're trying to quantify these 6 variables for all possible cases. So it's really an exhaustive listing of all these 6 tuple values for an organization to come up with a complete risk management posture. And when you evaluate these asset threats and vulnerabilities, you can either start by listing down the assets which are exposed to vulnerabilities and threats and go about doing the analysis that way, or you can start out with threats, start out with a list of threats that the organization faces, and identify the vulnerabilities that are exploitable by these threats and the assets that might be affected by this. So the idea is to evaluate these 6 variables, and you can start out with assets first or threat first, doesn't matter. The idea is to list them out exhaustively and to automate the whole process of doing this so that you're able to understand and get a complete holistic view of the risk posture for the organization. So now we have a risk model which allows us to model risk using the 6 variables that I talked about. And now the next step is to talk about a process that allows you to go through the process of evaluating the risk. And this is a bit of an eye chart, but let me spend some time taking you through it. And any risk methodology will have to follow these steps one way or the other. And if you look at the 6 steps that I talked about, 6 variables that I talked about, are really the first 6 steps here, right? So the first step is system characterization, which is basically trying to identify all the assets that are in the organization. You're looking at hardware, software, people, data that's in the organization, and the result is essentially a set of system functions and critical data that's residing in different parts of the organization. The second step is to look at threats that the business might face. And this threat information can come from historical perspective based on attacks that might have happened in the past. It can come from other intelligence agencies that are looking at all threats across the board. And the result is essentially a threat statement that tells you what are the threats that are possible for a particular business. So threats could be, fire hazard, earthquake. It could be insider being not trustworthy. Any possible scenario that can lead to an asset being compromised is a threat. The third step is to identify the vulnerabilities that the assets that were identified in the first stage could have. And associate a risk level, which can be a qualitative level or a quantified level. And once you know the risk exposure with the priorities, you can then come up with a set of control recommendations to fix the risk exposure by focusing on the highest problem areas that you as an organization face. And then you can document this and repeat this as and when either the assets change or when the threat levels have changed, or if there's a new vulnerability that might have come about. So if there's a change in any of the 6 variables that I talked about happens, there's a need to go back and do risk analysis, or you can do it every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, depending on how often things change. So the quantifying of the risk formula, as I said earlier, can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. This is an example of a qualitative scale where you're looking at the likelihood of certain threat events happening being from very low to very high, the level of impact being very low to very high, and the combinations thereby result in a combination of very high to very low risk exposure. And this is one way of kind of managing your risk, or the other is to assign values to likelihood and impact, and then quantify the total risk exposure, which can be calibrated to a scale of 0 to 100, so that you have a risk score that you want to manage, and lower the risk exposure, better it is. And there are multiple tools which allow you to do that. And from a HIPAA high-tech perspective, again, as an example, I mentioned earlier that security risk analysis is required for supporting meaningful use, for getting the federal grant dollars, and sometimes if you do it manually, it can take about 70% of the time required for showing meaningful use. And thankfully, I'll talk about 85, which has a completely automated way of managing the whole process. So now let's having discussed the risk model, discuss the risk management process, let's talk about an automated way of managing the whole process, which is AGFI. AGFI is a cloud-based software-only tool that manages your security and compliance posture completely, and it's got built-in support for multiple compliance frameworks, certainly HIPAA high-tech, PCI, SOX, FISMA, but you can add any customized control to the framework. It supports built-in support for vulnerability management, again through the cloud, no hardware needed, and it has support for risk management and asset management. Those are critical stages in doing risk analysis besides managing your security and compliance posture. What you can do with it, you can manage your security and compliance with the tool. It's completely automated. You can manage your risk posture using the risk management model that I talked about earlier by looking at all the variables, and you can take the report output from the tool to submit it to the federal government to get your meaningful use dollars. And not only that, you can also manage the security and compliance risk posture for any of the vendors that you work with. In the case of HIPAA, it's business associates. In the case of PCI, it's merchants and vendors. So it allows you to manage not only your internal security and compliance posture, but any external vendors that you work with. The typical cycle of monitoring security and compliance is shown here. This is supported by AGFI, and it automates the whole process, but let me walk you through the steps that are involved. So typically when you're coming in fresh and you're trying to assess where does the organization stand today with respect to the security and compliance posture, so you're trying to do an assessment to calibrate the current security and compliance posture with respect to the requirements. The requirements can come from HIPAA high-tech, it can come from any other framework like PCI, FISMA, SOX. So you start out by doing a security scan and a compliance assessment, which will give you a gap report with risk exposure. And that will tell you which risk levels, which risk exposures are relevant to your business, what's the priority, relative priority of these risk exposures, so that you can then go about plugging the gaps that were found by the tool through this automated scanning process. So the next stage is then to put together a remediation plan with a security strategy. It might involve putting together new policies and contracts. It might involve employee training, putting together best practices and roles and responsibilities that you might have to assign within the organization. And this is typically done with the help of our service providers that work with us, who will work with end customers to implement the remediation process. And once that's done, you go back and reevaluate your security and compliance posture, your risk posture, so that you're on top of all the things that are happening in your business. So you have a continuous security and compliance monitoring dashboard that allows you to manage the whole process. And all the steps that I talked about from a risk assessment methodology point of view, it's supported by AGFI, and we essentially automate the whole process so that you are essentially filling up forms and kind of either ascertaining yes and no to what the system has automatically figured out through an automated scanning process. So let's take an example of a HIPAA security risk analysis. So typically the steps involved in risk management includes, first step is to identify all the assets that have PHI information. This is something that the tool will do automatically for you. And then the next step is to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities that these assets might be affected by. Again, the tool will provide you with baseline threats and vulnerabilities that you can enhance if you need to, or you deprecate certain threat levels and vulnerabilities that are not pertinent. And the idea is to kind of look at all that is valid and applicable to you as a business. And then you go about looking at current security measures, the controls that are in place. It's again a question of figuring out which are relevant, which are in place, which are not, and that will give you, and then you need to assign certain likelihoods and potential impacts for your business, for your organization, for these threats and the likelihood and impact values with respect to a dollar amount, and out it comes with a risk value that you can then use as a measure to plug the gaps. And so you can essentially use Agify to continuously manage your risk management process. You can implement through Agify. You can do a risk assessment. You can follow the entire set of steps required for any framework, not just HIPAA, using the tool, and it'll minimize your headache or burden of keeping up with the changes, and you don't have to start from scratch for every framework. This is a little more detailed chart, but I won't go through this. Essentially, it talks about how does the tool automate the process of the different steps, and suffice it to say that the tool will pre-populate wherever possible with information that's relevant and pertinent. It will scan the network. It will scan all assets that are reachable, and pre-populate the information so that you are left with minimal information filling to come up with a complete risk analysis and risk management framework for your business. And at the end of it all, the tool will give you your real-time security and compliance posture. As you see here, this is the executive dashboard, which tells you what is your security risk level, what is the compliance risk level, and it will identify the assets and the vulnerabilities and the controls that need attention. And so you can focus on the ones that are most important and fix them first, followed by the rest that are not as important potentially. Or you can moderate the risk levels to manage the lower risk issues so that you don't need to fix them. By the way, I would invite you to download a free version of the tool from egistol.com. This will allow you to run the scanner on your network very quickly to get you a quick view of your security and compliance posture. It'll take a few minutes to download, and it'll take about half an hour to 1 hour to scan your network, and it'll identify all the issues that might be there in your business. The tool provides a very simplified, self-guided, help-based approach to all the questions. In the case of assessments, these are simple yes and no questions that you'll be asked. You can upload evidence in the tool. There is a knowledge base with built-in policy documents, with built-in guidance on what are the best practices that you need to follow as an organization, so that you are able to seek help either from the tool or from a service provider that you're working with. It also comes in pre-packaged and pre-populated with policy documents like business associate agreement in the case of HIPAA, which tells you exactly what you need to protect and what kind of contract you need to have with external vendors to ensure that they're following the HIPAA Omnibus rule. As you would recall, in HIPAA Omnibus, both the covered entity and their BAs and subcontractors are required by law to have a BA agreement to deal with any PHI privacy and security violation issues. There is built-in research and knowledge base. I talked about this. The citation guidance, there's best practices that we've leveraged from NIST and the other organizations that will help you understand what the requirements are and follow the law. And then you can use a risk management form and a wizard-based approach to pre-populate and fill in the information that's missing, so that you are able to manage and come up with a risk posture for your organization. It'll tell you also the top vulnerabilities that affect our business and how to fix them. So it's got complete guidance on what are the different vulnerabilities and how to fix them. If there are patches missing, if there are default passwords that are present that can be exploited, the system will warn you about those so that you can go about addressing them. And then at the end of it, you'll be able to generate a report on compliance that tells you your compliance posture, your security posture. You can also know about the compliance and risk posture of any of the vendors that you work with. In the case of HIPAA High-Tech, you'll know your business associates' security and compliance posture as well. And at any point in time, you'll have a complete visibility and view of all the current status of your security and compliance posture. So in closing, what I would like to emphasize is that risk management is a complex topic, and what we've tried to do is to demystify it by talking about the risk factors that are involved in a risk management process. We talked about the risk model and the risk management process, thereby to assess the risk posture. And there's a qualitative measure, there's a quantitative measure, and typically either or of those methods could be used to assess the risk posture. For automating the whole process, which can be exhaustive and can be time consuming, there's a need to automate the whole process, and AG5 provides a framework, built-in model, which allows you to completely automate not just your security and compliance management, but also your risk posture. And depending on which frameworks you want to support, it has built-in support for that. You can do security risk analysis and also manage your external vendors through the tool. I would urge you to find out whether your service provider that you work with supports AG5. If not, we're happy to connect you with one of our channel partners to better understand what the tool can do for you, and we welcome your suggestions on how to improve it as well. With that, I will open it up for Q&A. Mike, are you there?
Okay, great. Yep, I'm here. Thanks, Anupam. Thanks for presenting. We'll open it up for Q&A now. Feel free to ask any of your questions in the questions area of GoToWebinar. Anupam, are you ready for the first question?
Sure.
Do you have procedures and forms for all the e-procedures?
Yes, we have the built-in framework for certain compliance frameworks, and there'll be pre-populated baseline forms, if you're calling that form, or values or instantiation of the variables will be available in the tool. That's correct.
Okay, and how do I know when and how often, let me try and put this together, the sentence, Anupam, 1 second. How do I know when and how often do I know when a policy should be done?
When a policy should be done? Sorry, you broke up at the end. What was the question again?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me reread it. How do I know when and how often do I know when a policy should be done?
So the policy, as I said, the whole evaluation or assessment should be done as frequently as needed. It could be a function of how often the law changes. So, for example, HIPAA High-Tech, the policies that you had in place last year is no longer valid because HIPAA Omnibus came out in January of 2013, and so you need to redo the policies because of that. So really it's a function of how often is the business needs changing, if the regulation environment changing, or if there are new employees and assets that are coming and that would require you to relook at the policy. So it's a function of the change that's happening and the need to reevaluate your security and compliance posture as a result of that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anupam. How is HIPAA Omnibus different from High-Tech?
So that's a long topic. Actually, I do have a webinar that you can go to egestalt.com which discusses this in detail. But HIPAA Omnibus brings about a lot of new changes that are present in High-Tech in some form, but really are either clarified or reinforced in HIPAA Omnibus. And HIPAA Omnibus brings about some new guidelines as well. So I would urge you to go to egestalt.com website. Under resources, webinars, you'll see a number of webinars done by me on HIPAA Omnibus. Or you can connect with me separately offline. I'll be happy to discuss this with you in detail.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anupam. What is construed as willful neglect, and are the fines higher?
So willful neglect is that if you know that, for example, in the case of HIPAA high-tech, that you need to follow the law, and if you're not taking steps or showing enough reasons to justify not taking action, that's considered to be a willful neglect. In short, if you know that you need to be HIPAA high-tech compliant, you're not taking steps towards it, you could be open to that risk exposure. So that's and that's the September 2013 deadline, right? That everybody needs to be HIPAA high-tech compliant and to take steps towards proving that they are making reasonable effort towards that direction.
Okay, thanks, Anupam. What are the unique features of eGestalt's Edify HIPAA solution?
Yeah, so the unique features is really in the automation of the tool, of the HIPAA high-tech compliance process. The tool supports all the latest HIPAA omnibus guidelines. It provides an automated way of staying on top of the changes, regulation changes. It will help you manage and automate your risk management process. And then it comes built in with a knowledge base that lets you know what are the best practices that are out there that you can adopt that will make you compliant, will make you secure. And this is all done through the cloud, software-based approach only, no hardware at an affordable cost.
Thanks, Anupam. How do you price the solution?
So pricing varies depending on the services that you're trying to buy. So we have risk, security management, compliance management. Typically, a business would a small entry-level pricing would start at $1,200 to $1,500 per year, all the way to $10,000 per year, depending on the size of the business and the modules that you would buy. But we are if not one of the cheapest solutions out there in terms of cost effectiveness, in terms of the automation, and in terms of the completeness of the solution that's available from any other vendor there.
Anupam, are channel partners approved in some way by eGestalt?
That's right. So we have a channel partner program where we kind of take you through a training process, and there is certainly an engagement model. And if you're interested in becoming a partner, please reach out to me via email or the contact information, and we can discuss further on that.
And do you have tips for dealing with companies who think the best approach to security is denial?
Sorry, you were a little broken up there. Could you repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. Do you have tips for dealing with companies who think the best approach to security is denial? I'm sure you have a lot of tips for them.
Yep. So all the breaches that I showed you earlier, where 20 to 25 million breaches are happening per month, are those companies who are still in denial. And good luck to them is what I would say, because really the cyber attackers are a lot more sophisticated. And I showed some data earlier that it takes weeks and months for businesses to discover that they've been breached. And cyber attackers literally take seconds and minutes to break in, steal all the data, and then you're left holding the bag. So people who still believe that they can deny this, all good luck to them.
Great. Thanks, Anupam. Looks like all the questions have been answered. If you have any questions after this webinar, Anupam's information is right there on the screen. You can go ahead and email him or call him at that email address or phone number. One last question here. Well, this isn't really a question. It's more of a statement that you can see and answer after the webinar here. Anupam, I'll send it over to you. Thank you to the attendees for attending today. And looks like we're right at the hour anyway. Anupam, I'll leave the last word with you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I know this is a kind of a complex topic, and I would like to get your thoughts and feedback on the webinar contents or any new topics that you would like to hear going forward. So thank you again, and good morning and good afternoon, and have a good day.
Okay, thank you, Anupam. Thank you, attendees. Have a great day. Bye-bye.